The weighty oak doors thudded shut behind me as I walked into the grand entryway of the estate I had cared for over the years. The marble floor, gleaming under the chandelier's gentle light, stood in sharp contrast to the anger quietly burning inside me. "Isabella!" His voice rang out, sharp and commanding, echoing along the corridor. I set my jaw before turning to face him. There was James Davenport, calling himself a business tycoon, inheriting billions, and most significantly, the man who had just embarrassed me in front of his guests. He marched over, wine glass in hand, a deep red stain from the Cabernet still fresh on his silk tie. I'd cleaned that tie countless times before, along with every expensive suit he owned, not that he ever acknowledged it. To him, I was invisible. Just staff. "You lazy piece of garbage," he spat out, arrogance heavy in his tone. "I asked for a single thing, just one, and you can't even get that right." I felt a dozen eyes focused on me. His dinner guests, bankers, lawyers, men whose hands had never worked a day, watched the drama play out as if it were a show. For them, this was pure amusement. James shook his head and let out a sharp breath. "I pay you to do what I say. That's your purpose here, isn't it? Scrubbing floors, bringing drinks, cleaning my messes." I swallowed hard, my hands curling into tight fists at my sides. "Not now, Isabella. Wait." James Davenport was clueless. For 6 years, I'd tolerated his cruelty, his careless insults, his endless demands, the way he looked right past me, as if I didn't exist. He saw housekeepers as disposable, to be tossed aside once they'd served their use. What he didn't realize, never even thought to ask, was that this mansion wasn't his. It was mine. Tonight, he had finally given me the perfect reason to reclaim what belonged to me. James liked to think he was the master here, but the truth was, he was only ever a tenant, living in a palace that was never really his. Soon, he'd have to face reality. I forced myself to remain calm and play the part of the obedient employee one last time. "I'm sorry, Mr. Davenport," I replied, my voice steady. "What would you like me to do?" He rolled his eyes. "What do you think? Clean it up!" he snapped, gesturing at his stained tie as if it was a disaster. "And make it quick." I nodded and looked down, reaching for the cloth tucked into my apron. As I started to dab at the fabric, he shook his head and laughed under his breath. "Pathetic," he muttered, making sure his guests could hear him. Laughter drifted through the dining room. I committed every face to memory. Every single person in that room would remember this night, because after tonight, James Davenport would never get the chance to humiliate me again. He didn't notice when, while I cleaned, I quietly slipped a key from my pocket, one that looked exactly like the key on his own ring. My key, the master key to the entire estate. He'd never questioned it when I arrived as a quiet housekeeper. Once his little performance ended, James turned away and rejoined his guests. I excused myself and made my way down the familiar halls. My halls. I walked past the high shelves in the study, the grand piano I played as a child, the ornate hallway mirror where my mother once fixed her pearls before leaving for charity galas. James thought he was born into this kind of power, but he never truly belonged here. This house was my family's long before it became his. Now, it was finally time to take it back. By tomorrow, he'd learn what arrogance really costs. When I got to my small servants' quarters at the back of the mansion, I took out the last document I needed, a legal eviction notice, signed, sealed, and ready to be delivered. James Davenport had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and soon he would pay the price. The grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight. I sat down at the little wooden desk in my room, a soft yellow lamp casting shadows on the worn wallpaper. In front of me were the final papers for my plan, documents I'd spent years preparing, waiting for just the right moment. James had just handed me that moment. My fingertips traced the edge of the eviction notice. It was real. It was happening. For 6 years, I'd scrubbed my own floors, dusted the chandeliers my grandmother picked out, polished the staircase banisters my father touched as a boy. Every day, I'd let James bark orders as if he owned me. I'd swallowed my pride, letting him believe he was in control. But there was a reason I endured all of it. My family had built this mansion over 100 years ago. It was our legacy, passed down for generations. But even great wealth can't protect you forever. When my parents died in a car accident, everything fell apart. Debt collectors, shady business partners, lawsuits I was too young to handle. Suddenly, my inheritance vanished. By the time I turned 22, the estate was ruined and every penny drained by battles I couldn't win. Eventually, the mansion, my childhood home, was seized and auctioned off to pay off debts I couldn't even prove existed. And who bought it? James Davenport Sr., who knew exactly what he was doing. He took advantage of my grief and bought the estate for far less than it was worth. He said he'd take care of it, but once the papers were signed, he stripped the house of everything that made it ours. The art was sold, antiques auctioned, the library gutted, rare first editions replaced with modern nonsense. Then he died, and his useless son, James Davenport III, took everything. He was the definition of entitled, someone who had never lifted a finger in his life, a man who saw family legacy as something to exploit, not cherish. My home became nothing more than a trophy for him, a backdrop for his shallow parties, a place where money and influence decided who mattered. I could have tried to fight for the estate back then, maybe dragged it out in court. But I knew James. He would have destroyed the entire mansion out of spite before ever letting me reclaim it. So I waited. I made myself invisible. I let him hire me as his housekeeper, and it never once occurred to him to question why I wanted the position. To James, I was just another nameless face, eager for whatever crumbs he might toss my way. For 6 years, I played my role to perfection. Every contract, every bank statement, every carelessly abandoned paper on his desk, I made copies. I kept my eyes open, listened, and stayed patient. Until now. I folded the eviction notice neatly and slid it into its envelope. This house was mine, by right and by blood. What James never understood was that his father had only managed to buy it through a loophole I'd spent years uncovering. And the final twist? James had never read a single contract he signed. He poured millions into parties, into failed business ideas, and took out loan after loan against the mansion, loans he never bothered to repay. The house became collateral, and last month the bank quietly sold that debt to me. James Davenport III was no longer the owner here. He was nothing but a tenant, and time was running out for him. I closed my eyes for a moment, thinking of my parents. Would they be proud of me? Maybe some would call this revenge, say I should have left it to fate. But this wasn't just about vengeance. It was about restoring what had been stolen. James robbed me of my home, my dignity, and my family's history. He acted like I was beneath him, as if I was nothing at all. He was about to learn how it felt to have everything taken from him. Tomorrow, I would step into his office, not as his housekeeper, but as the woman holding his future in her hands. The morning sunlight spilled across the marble floors as I walked the halls, one last time as the servant he thought I was. The air was filled with the scent of fresh polish and coffee, smells that had become familiar over the years. But today, everything felt different. I wasn't here to serve. I was here to reclaim what belonged to me. "Isabella!" His voice, irritated and impatient, echoed through the corridor right on cue. I turned the corner and found him lounging at the long mahogany dining table where he held his pointless, power-laced breakfasts. He wore a silk robe carelessly draped over his shoulders, his hair uncombed. He barely glanced up, waving me off. "Where's my coffee?" It was the last command he'd ever give me. I smiled, calm and collected. "It's on the counter, Mr. Davenport," I replied, my voice even. He snorted, barely looking up from his phone. "Do you want a tip for that?" I let the silence hang for a moment before moving to the kitchen counter. I picked up 2 envelopes. One, his daily newspaper, wrapped in plastic. The other, his eviction notice. Returning to the table, I set both in front of him. "Here's your paper, sir," I said coolly, "and an urgent document you'll want to read right away." He barely acknowledged me, unfolding his newspaper with his usual indifference, sipping coffee as if he had all the time in the world. Then his eyes fell on the second envelope. "What's this?" he muttered, flipping it over. I remained silent. His fingers tore open the envelope, pulling out the official eviction notice, the crisp letterhead a jarring contrast to the financial news he'd just been reading. His gaze scanned the page, then froze. His eyes went wide. The color drained from his face as he sat bolt upright. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. I tilted my head, playing innocent. "Oh, that? That's a legal notice confirming the property's change in ownership. Your lease is terminated as of today. You have exactly 24 hours to leave." He stared at me, mouth opening and closing in disbelief. After a beat, he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You're joking, right?" He tossed the papers back onto the table. "Ha, very funny. Now go get my breakfast." I didn't move. My smile didn't budge. "Mr. Davenport," I said calmly, "I really suggest you read the fine print, because as of this moment, this house is mine." James snatched the documents, his hands shaking as he read them more closely. His lips parted as reality set in. "Wait, this says the bank sold the debt. What does that mean? How is this possible?" "It means," I interrupted, letting my voice harden at last, "you've been living here on borrowed time. You took out massive loans against the estate, loans you never repaid. The bank repossessed the property, and when they sold your debt—" I leaned in, watching the panic flicker in his eyes. "I bought it." He sprang up, knocking over his coffee. The cup shattered on the floor. "No!" he shouted, pointing at me. "That's impossible! You're just a—" He stopped himself. "Just a housekeeper. Just the help." I folded my arms and raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead. Finish what you were about to say." His jaw tightened. "You're lying," he hissed, his voice barely controlled. "This is fake. There's no way you could afford this. You don't have that kind of money." I shrugged and took a step back as he fumed. "Actually, I do. I've spent 6 years preparing for this moment, watching you, tracking your habits, your wasteful spending. I always knew this day would come. You just never saw it coming." His hands balled into fists, his breathing fast and uneven. "What do you want?" he demanded. "Is this about money? Fine. How much? Just say it." I laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, James," I said, shaking my head with a sigh. "You still don't get it, do you?" I stepped closer to him, slow and steady, until we were almost face to face. "It was never about money," I whispered. "This was always about taking back what you stole from me." James recoiled, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Stole?" he echoed, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded. "Did you really believe you owned this place? That your father just picked up this mansion for your family like it was nothing?" I let out a short, bitter laugh. "No, James. This estate was in my family for more than 100 years. My parents lived here, my grandparents before them. This was my home, long before you were ever born." I watched as realization settled on his face. "My father?" "Yes," I replied quietly. "Your father took it. He took advantage of my family's tragedy, and when he died, he left you all his dirty secrets." James stumbled back, grabbing the edge of the table like he needed it to steady himself. "You're lying," he whispered, but his words lacked conviction. I pulled one more document from my pocket, a faded deed, still signed in my grandfather's name. I let it fall onto the table in front of him. "Read it and weep, James." He glanced between me and the papers. The man who had mocked and belittled me for years was suddenly powerless. I had won. James just stood there, fingers crushing the eviction notice so hard the corners bent. His breath came in uneven bursts, his proud posture collapsing under the weight of a truth he couldn't escape. The once mighty James Davenport, who spent years treating me like I was nothing, was falling apart in front of me. But I wasn't finished. This isn't over, James," he spat, his voice trembling. "I'll fight this. I'll call my lawyers. You can't just take my house." I raised an eyebrow. "Your house?" I repeated, letting out a slow, amused laugh. "You mean my house? The one you and your father stole from my family?" James's nostrils flared. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he sneered. "Maybe you found a loophole. Maybe you played the system, but I'm not leaving. You can't just throw me out like some stray dog." I crossed my arms. "Oh, but I can," I said, tilting my head. "And I already have." I stepped aside, revealing the security team waiting in the doorway. James's face drained of color. "What is this?" he demanded. "Since you refuse to leave on your own," I said calmly, "I went ahead and hired some professionals to help you pack." His eyes darted to the two uniformed men behind me, their faces unreadable. You're serious?" he stammered. "As serious as that eviction notice you're holding," I answered evenly. "You have 24 hours to gather your things and go, and if you refuse—" I smiled just a little. "My legal team will make sure the job gets done." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. James Davenport, the same man who'd spent years humiliating me, was completely powerless. Yet I could still see it in his eyes, the desperate hope that he could somehow wriggle out of this. He slammed his hands on the table. "Let's talk, Isabella," he said abruptly, forcing a thin smile. "We're both business-minded people. There's got to be a deal we can make." I sighed, acting as if I was considering it. "A deal?" I repeated, eyebrows raised. "Yes." He straightened his shoulders, pretending he was still in control. "I'll buy the house back from you. I'll pay double what you paid, triple even." He laughed nervously, as if the idea of money fixing everything was obvious. I shook my head. "Not interested." His smile faltered. "Come on, Isabella. Be reasonable." That word. Reasonable. The word men like James only used when they'd run out of power, when they suddenly needed fairness. I stepped forward and planted my hands on the table. "Were you ever reasonable with me?" I asked, voice cold. He swallowed, silent. "For 6 years I worked here, my house, and you treated me like dirt. You mocked me, embarrassed me in front of your friends, called me garbage." His jaw tightened. "And now that you're losing everything, now you want to negotiate?" I let out a dry laugh. "That's rich." He started to protest, but I cut him off. "You have nothing I want, James. There's nothing you can offer that would make up for what you've done." I leaned in, dropping my voice low. "I'm not here to bargain. I'm here to take back what's mine." James turned to the security team, panic rising. "You can't let her do this!" he barked. "I'll call the police! I'll have you arrested!" One of the guards, built like a wall, smirked just a little. "Sir," he said, calm but clear, "she's the legal owner of this house. If anyone should call the police, it's her." James's eyes went wide, flicking between the guards and me. It was over. There would be no rescue, no sudden solution. The mighty James Davenport had lost. His face twisted with frustration, rage taking over. "You're a vindictive little—" I lifted a hand. "Careful, James," I said softly. "Don't make your last words in this house ones you'll regret." He shut his mouth, the silence between us heavy. After a long pause, he dropped into a chair, defeated and gray-faced. "What do you want from me?" he croaked, voice raw. "Nothing," I replied simply. "I just want you out." I looked to the security team. "Make sure he's packed and gone by morning," I instructed. "And if he tries to damage anything on his way out—" I turned back to James, narrowing my eyes. "Escort him off the property right then and there." The guards nodded. James understood there was no point in arguing anymore. It was over. For the first time in his life, someone had taken something from him, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. I turned to leave, my job here complete. But before stepping through the door, I glanced back one last time. James sat slumped in his chair, staring into space, his hands still clutching the eviction notice as if it might magically change if he just looked hard enough. "Enjoy your last night here, James," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Because tomorrow, he would wake up to a new world, one where he had nothing, and I had everything." By sunrise, James Davenport was gone. The mansion had fallen silent. I stood at the front entrance, arms crossed, watching as the final moving van rolled down the driveway. The estate, which had echoed with his arrogance for years, was finally quiet, and finally mine. And it had never felt more peaceful. But for James, the lesson was just beginning. He was about to learn what it meant to truly lose. I took a deep breath and stepped through the double doors, back into my home. Mine again, in every sense, for the first time in years. The air was lighter, as if the whole house had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. Gone were the cold, expensive decorations he'd filled the rooms with, the designer furniture, the empty modern art, all those hollow displays of wealth. The house had returned to its rightful owner. I trailed my fingers along the wooden staircase railing, memories flooding in. My mother's laughter from the sitting room, my father's voice echoing down the hallway. My own childhood, spent in rooms stripped of warmth when the Davenports took over. But now, it was up to me to bring that warmth back. This was my home to rebuild. While I savored my victory, James was out in the real world, getting his first taste of failure. His downfall wasn't just a private defeat. It was all over the headlines. By the time he woke up in his luxury penthouse, one of the last assets he had left, the press had already exploded with the Davenport Mansion scandal. Headlines blared. James Davenport evicted from family estate, legal loophole or fatal mistake. Wealthy heir loses multi-million-dollar home overnight. Who's really to blame? Power shift. Former housekeeper becomes mansion's true owner. That last headline was my favorite. James had always lived for image and reputation. He thrived on feeling untouchable, convinced he was the king of his own universe. Now, that world was falling apart, and I didn't have to do a thing. His own arrogance had paved the way for his undoing. It didn't shock me when my phone rang that afternoon. His number lit up my screen. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. "Isabella?" His voice was hoarse, strained. I didn't say a word. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. I let him sit with it, let him truly feel the loss. "Look," he finally exhaled, struggling to hold on to the last scraps of his dignity. I may have overreacted yesterday." I couldn't help but smile. "Did you?" I asked, amused. He hesitated, then said, I want to meet. Just talk. No fighting, just an honest conversation." I looked out the window, watching the wind ripple through the trees on the estate. I don't think so, I replied. James scoffed. Come on, Isabella. You can't honestly be this petty. What do you want, to watch me suffer? I considered it for a moment. No, I said quietly. Watching you suffer doesn't matter to me, James. I only care about one thing. And what's that? He snapped. I smiled to myself. That you never set foot in this house again. Silence. Then, you think you've won, he growled. You think you've beaten me? I sighed. James, this isn't a game. I already won. You're just refusing to accept it. He exhaled sharply, frustration seeping into his words. You're going to regret this, he muttered. I laughed, light and genuine. Oh, James, I said softly. I've never been so sure of anything in my life. And I ended the call. James had lost his home, but soon he'd lose everything else. What he didn't realize was that the Davenport name wasn't as untouchable as he believed. Now that the scandal was public, his investors started to run. His father's former partners, the same men who once trusted him without question, were suddenly doubting his ability to lead. By the end of the week, the corporate rumors were swirling. If he couldn't even keep his own house, how can he run a business? Is Davenport Enterprises still stable? Maybe it's time to pull our money. James wasn't just falling. He was in a free fall. And me? I was finally free. That night, I stood on the mansion's balcony with a glass of wine, looking out over the city. For the first time in years, I could breathe. No more hiding. No more swallowing my pride. No more being invisible in my own family home. This was my second chance. I'd expected revenge to feel like fire, like burning satisfaction. But standing there in the quiet, the cool night air on my skin, all I felt was peace. James had spent his life taking from others. Now, for once, he knew what it was like to lose. And as for me, I was done with him. James Davenport had always believed he was untouchable. His money had always bailed him out. His name had opened every door. His ego had told him he could walk over anyone and always land on his feet. But now? Now he was sinking fast, and there was no one left to save him. It had been 2 weeks since James was forced out of the mansion. I hadn't heard from him since that last desperate call, where he tried to bargain, threaten, and cling to whatever scraps of power he imagined he still had. Still, I'd kept tabs on him, not out of worry, just curiosity. James was unraveling even faster than I expected. His penthouse, once a symbol of his wealth and status, was now swamped with reporters hounding him for a statement. His business empire was crumbling, investors pulling out before he could even react. Worst of all, the so-called friends who used to laugh at his jokes while I scrubbed his floors? They'd vanished without a trace. When you're on top, everyone wants to be seen with you. When you start to fall, suddenly they pretend you never existed. James was still hanging on to one last hope: Davenport Enterprises. It was all he had left standing between him and total ruin. What he didn't realize was that his own board of directors had already made the decision to cut him loose, and I was about to witness it firsthand. I didn't need to go looking for James. He came to me. I was in the study, my study now, when my assistant knocked at the door. "Miss Isabella," she said gently, "you have a visitor." I already knew who it was. James stood in the grand foyer, looking like a shadow of the man he used to be. The arrogance was gone, the tailored suits replaced by a rumpled shirt and tired eyes. He looked like he'd aged a decade in just a few weeks. For the first time, James Davenport truly looked like someone who had lost. I approached him slowly, my heels echoing on the marble. "James," I greeted, my tone smooth and controlled. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He exhaled hard, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I need your help," he said, finally admitting it. I let the moment hang in the air. Then I actually laughed. "Help?" I echoed, tilting my head. You must be joking. James clenched his jaw. I know I treated you terribly, he forced out, but you have no idea what's happening right now. Oh, I think I do, I replied, arms folded. Your stock is in freefall. Investors are fleeing. Your company's on the edge of collapse. And if I had to guess, I tapped my chin. Your board is probably meeting right now, debating whether to kick you out as CEO. He stiffened. That was all the confirmation I needed. I was right. They were ready to oust him, and he knew it. James drew a shaky breath, trying to keep himself together. I just need time. A few weeks. I can fix this if you... I raised a hand to cut him off. Let's not pretend you think I'll save you. You're here because you have nowhere else to turn, James. No one left. His silence was louder than any admission. James Davenport, the man who once called me worthless, was now standing in my home, begging for help. And he knew I wasn't going to give it. You've spent your whole life using people, James, I said quietly. But now there's no one left to use. His hands balled into fists. I made a mistake, he whispered, barely audible. I raised an eyebrow. A mistake? I repeated. James, you didn't just slip up. You made a career out of treating everyone like they were beneath you. You built your kingdom on other people's pain, and now... I shrugged. Now you finally know what it's like to be the one losing. James was trembling. I could see the desperation flicker in his eyes. For the first time, he had no control, and it was eating him alive. I stepped a little closer, lowering my voice. You should go now, James, before you humiliate yourself any further. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For years, he'd always had the last word, but not today. Today, I took that from him, too. James stepped back, then again, and turned away without a word. He walked out the door. That night, the news broke everywhere. James Davenport removed as CEO, board votes unanimously for his ouster. Davenport empire falls, heir loses power, wealth, and influence overnight. I sat in my study, sipping wine, watching the headlines. James had always looked down on me, but now? Now he had nowhere left to fall, and I'd never felt lighter. I was never after revenge. I wanted justice. James had never believed he could lose. He never imagined the people he'd stepped on might ever rise above him. But eventually, if you treat people like dirt long enough, they start to rise. And when they do, the fall is so much worse. I walked through the mansion's halls, my fingers trailing along the walls I'd known since childhood. This wasn't just victory, it was restoration. I'd reclaimed my family's legacy. I'd taken back my power. And James? Wherever he was finally learning what real powerlessness felt like. And me? I was just getting started.